Welcome, everyone, to our weekly NOVAFRICA seminar. We are thrilled and fortunate to have with us Dr. Katherine Vyborny, who's going to present to us about the political influences on police responses to crime. As per usual, we'll have questions just during the talk. So Dr. Vyborny has said, feel free to unmute your microphone and interrupt with questions. And we have until 4 p.m. We may not use all that time, but without any further ado, I'll turn the time over to Dr. Vyborny. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Obrigada. I'm really excited to be here virtually, although I wasn't able to make it in person last year. It's been a real pleasure to meet with some of you earlier today and kind of get to know a little bit more about the center, which has always been really exciting and impressive in its work. So I'm presenting today joint work with Hamna Ahmed and Dareen Latif from the Lahore School of Economics. And I will try to advance my slide. Yes. Okay, so just to motivate, there's a pretty vast literature showing evidence that citizens benefit from political alignment with the party elected to office, by which I mean either being voters of that party or in constituencies that supported that party. And that's consistent with a pretty basic model where politicians demand better services for their constituents. There is an open question about what enables them to kind of do this function of kind of demanding better constituent services more effectively, and a bit more recent literature looking at how technology might interact with this, in particular technology for sort of monitoring and tracking activities by government officials like bureaucrats or teachers, any kind of employees who are actually doing the day-to-day work of delivering services to the population. But there's kind of a growing understanding that the effect of these sorts of monitoring and tracking technologies might also interact with the incentives of both those reporting, but also those using the data. So the principal, in this case, the politician who's looking at the data on the other end. What are they trying to achieve with looking at with sort of using monitoring technology or tracking what's going on in terms of service delivery? And so in this study, we're hoping to kind of contribute to this intersection of literatures using administrative microdata from hundreds of thousands, or actually about 1 million individual citizen reports to police in Lahore district in Pakistan over an electoral period in order to investigate how political alignment with the winning party affects how complaints of police are filed and handled. So we're going to use the phase-in of a new database that tracked complaints in which a front desk officer starts recording information on the complaints before they're processed and recorded as a crime, to help us with two things. That's one, it's going to help us to separate out changes in crime from changes in how the police respond to crime. And two, it's also going to help us understand how better tracking might interact with political pressure. So I'm going to walk you in a bit more detail than I normally would through kind of a preview of findings, because I think it's going to help to kind of set up the framework of what we're trying to do empirically before getting into the context and the data. So we're going to find that areas that supported the party in office, that politically aligned, what we're calling politically aligned areas, have lower numbers of crimes that are recorded and processed. So there's several different possible reasons why we might see that aggregate pattern, and we're going to investigate them in detail. So the first possibility is just deterrence. It's a very classic kind of political economy story. The winning party politicians come in, they're trying to assist their own constituencies, the areas that voted them into office. And so they increase the resources available to those areas or pressure the police to increase their effort, leading to more deterrence and ultimately lower crime, fewer complaints or reports of crime coming in. So that's a basic story that we were kind of imagining might be going on as a possible factor in this headline result. The second possibility is that of patronage. So in this story, winning party politicians form alliances with local police to achieve a political objective. So there's evidence of this kind of dynamic in other sectors. For example, Mike Callan and co-authors find in studying healthcare workers, doctors specifically, in the same province that we're studying in Punjab in Pakistan, that political alignment actually seems to increase doctor absenteeism. So more doctors get posted, actual number of doctors appearing in the health clinic doesn't increase. They're basically not showing up to work, and they think what's going on is that the doctors are essentially helping the politicians campaign and doing other kinds of favors for them at a local level. So some sort of a patronage model like this could also potentially explain this headline result. The politicians basically are sort of saying, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I'll not give you too much of a hard time about processing crime if you also do things like bring a case against my opponent or one of his henchmen, or assist me in some way in campaigning. The third possibility is that of underreporting under pressure. So in this story, winning party politicians are going to increase their scrutiny on crime statistics from their constituencies. So they're trying to achieve the same thing they're trying to achieve in story one, but it ends up backfiring by leading the police officers to underrecord crimes to keep the stats low and keep the politicians off their back. So how are we going to separate out these three stories from each other? The first is we're going to do a whole bunch of things to rule out the first story, that of deterrence. So we have 6 kind of main findings that are going to help us to support this argument that it's not deterrence going on. I'm going to go through them in a lot more detail when I get to the results, but just to preview, the number of crimes drops right away. That stays stable over time. Hard to reconcile that with a story where any kind of resources are being adjusted and the situation is being improved. Secondly, complaints that actually get filed in any given category are less likely to be processed as official crimes. So this is where our data on both complaints and crime, officially recorded crimes, comes in. Complaints filed against the police are much less likely to be processed as official crimes. Hard to reconcile that with a deterrence story. We see a suggestive pattern that's consistent with reports essentially being downgraded from property crimes to lost reports that still give you your insurance payout, but don't require any action from the police. And finally, we do have some measures directly that look at inputs, and we don't see any change in response times from the police. We don't see any changes in staff inputs in the sense of how many police are actually posted to a given station, their level of seniority. So we really think all of the evidence really speaks pretty strongly against the story that what's happening here is a deterrence story. We don't think that the actual level of crime is going down. There's something else going on. Which of the other possible explanations could it be? Well, so to distinguish between the other 2 stories that I talked about, patronage versus underreporting under pressure, we are going to look at how political alignment interacted with the introduction of this new database of complaints, which we think made underreporting more difficult. So that actually we think produces kind of opposite predictions in terms of how the complaints database interacts with the political alignment under our 2 different mechanisms. If there's patronage, we should expect the new database should have less of an increase, lead to less of an increase in crime reports in areas that are politically aligned, because in those areas, the politicians are practicing patronage. They're saying to the officers, it's okay if you don't really work so hard as long as you help me out on these other dimensions. So we should expect that the database is less effective at increasing crime reports in those areas. Under story 3, the underreporting under pressure story, we should expect the opposite. So the new database should increase crime reports in areas that are politically aligned because the politicians are looking at the crime statistics more. They're putting more pressure on officers to perform. And when it gets harder to underreport, then the police are less able to kind of get out of it by underreporting. So what we find is that the effect of political alignment on crimes actually being processed into the official system actually disappears when the new database is introduced, or it drops to a level that's indistinguishable statistically from 0. And we think this suggests that the tracking technology may be helping to mitigate a problem of underreporting under political pressure. So that's my overview. Please, yes, I was just going to say if anybody wants to jump in at this point, please do.
Just out of curiosity, is there any major organized crime player in the area? So like a third party in between the government and citizens, maybe in the areas where the government is in charge. So the politically aligned areas, this organized crime has some political backing, so it's easier to not being reported as a criminal activity, let's say.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there's definitely some level of organized crime in the sense of, you know, gangs that organize things like, so for example, car theft rings are a common occurrence. I think that the level of organized crime that you're envisioning is one where there's like a close sort of mafia style relationship between the politicians and the organized crime ring. And my perception is that that's not the case in this particular context. In other parts of the country, in particular Karachi, I think that might be a more common occurrence. But I might follow up further with colleagues and partners here who might say more about that.
Thank you.
Kate, can you just clarify for me I know you already said this, but I missed it. The mechanism on the patronage, like why do we expect that under the patronage scenario, the introduction of the new database is going to increase crime reports less?
Yeah, so I think what we're thinking here is that if the politicians are basically, they have a kind of a deal with the police in their constituencies that says, if you don't work as hard, it's okay, because I'm going to ask you to do other things. Or like you could even think about it as a substitution or multitasking type of a situation where, okay, instead of working on kind of the day-to-day crime enforcement, I want you to focus on bringing down my opponent, some sort of story like that. Right. Then we should expect that they're not putting that pressure on the police. That when they see the statistics, that it would be when they have a better window into what's going on, that they would kind of increase that pressure and effectively increase the activity of does that make sense? Like, so in fact, it's actually, you might argue that that perhaps we should be predicting, there could be another version of this story where we would predict kind of a null effect, interaction effect here. Mm-hmm. But I think it should be either null or in this direction.
I see. So yeah, so I guess just to see if I'm understanding right, the idea is assuming that the new database is going to increase crime reports across the board, we expect that would happen less in the aligned areas under this story.
Less under the patronage story. Yes, I think that's right. Like, assuming that it actually works to make it as a technology to make it more.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I get it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I ask? Could the results be driven by some form of selection? So you find that the areas that supported the party in office have lower numbers of crimes. Could this be because they are happy with the results and therefore they support that party, and as opposed to other areas with higher levels of crime?
Yes, so we're going to show well, if I get time, I'll show a robustness check against that, but it's sort of tucked in right at the very end. So we do a robustness check against that by using, instead of using the contemporaneous political alignment, we use kind of the baseline political alignment with the party that won in the first election cycle, and the results look very similar. So we don't think, I think you're envisioning kind of a reverse causality story where it's not the political alignment that's affecting crime, it's the crime that's affecting the political alignment. And that I think we've ruled that out by looking at this kind of using the baseline measure instead of the current measure. Maybe. So please, raise it again if you think that when I get to that stage, if you think that it hasn't addressed it.
A small additional question. If I get it, it seems like all is about this comparison between the aligned and non-aligned areas. And I'm wondering why it should be the case that everything appears only in the aligned areas. Could it be the case that there's a change of behavior of the police or of the constituents in the non-aligned areas? And in particular here, I'm transposing what's happening with the press, where if you're aligned with the party in power, you're going to be much less likely to complain, while if you're not, you're going to pull out what doesn't work a lot more. So would it be the case that constituents in non-aligned areas are more likely to complain?
Yeah. So I think you're saying, basically your point is that we are focusing here on how the police respond, and we should also be thinking about whether people actually approach the police in the first place, right? Yes. So what I would say about that is that one of the advantages I think that we have with this data set, which I'll describe more in a minute, we have in the period after the complaints database is implemented, we actually have both the initial complaint and then whether it gets filed as an official police report. So while the initial complaint is not, it's not perfect as a measure. So we don't think that the initial complaint cannot be sort of also manipulated or affected by citizens' desire to come in, but it still gives us a pretty good wedge between those two things. Because if we see that people are coming in and we know that they came in because the front desk officer put their data into the database, but the police did not actually take that complaint and do anything about it. So then that gives us, I think, a more direct window into that mechanism. So it's something that's kind of unusual about this data as compared to a lot of other administrative data sets on police activity, that we are able to observe kind of multiple stages in the process to try to separate those things out. Okay, great.
Sorry, so I have a question. Yeah. Sorry.
Please, yeah.
So I'm just wondering how, I'm just trying to get my mind around how you distinguish between the deterrence effect and the incapacitation effect, right, within your mechanisms, right? So there's this whole literature about how it is very difficult to actually distinguish between the two. So I was wondering whether your data helps you to disentangle this effect. Then secondly, I was also wondering whether your data, whether you have an external data to validate your findings, right? So like the ICWS data that also reports crimes using Factiva as a database, whether you also use that to validate your results.
Okay, great. So I'll talk about the first point and then I'll come back to the, second point and then come back to the first, because I don't think I properly heard the first point. But on the second point about, I think you're proposing that we could use data from, for example, from press reports, which would provide an additional measure or a separate measure of whether crimes took place, in order to test whether that also tracks with what we're seeing in the complaints. Is it correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, we have talked about that, and we've thought about it as a potential extension for another project. I think there's two main challenges to it. The first is that from what we've seen, the data sets that are available for these kinds of data sets that are available don't have the level of fine-grained geocoding that we are using in the strategy here, because we're doing within district comparisons, and usually media-based reports are linked to a specific city, but not a particular neighborhood. So we're thinking about this more as something that we could do in another extension project if we're able to use data from the rest of the province. Currently, the data that we had available was for one particular district. The other, and probably I think more important concern that we have that we're still thinking about on this, but would welcome kind of thoughts about it. But I'm a little concerned that even media reports will still be reflecting in many cases what the police kind of make available, what information the police make available to the media. But I guess to be more clear about that, it would be nice to actually talk to some journalists here who do kind of crime reporting and understand more about how they get their information and whether they might pick up on crimes that wouldn't be officially recorded. So I think it's a really interesting direction for research, but I think it might be a bit tricky to incorporate into this project.
Yeah. Sorry, going back to that particular question, I do know that the ICEWS data, that is called the Integrated Crisis Early Warning System, I know that they have geocodes for each of the crime reports.
Right.
So you can easily use that and actually find out whether your results reflect the same based on the new database that you have. And going back to
I think it's just really, we're just using quite a small geographic area. That's the concern. Okay. But I will definitely check this data set, ICEWS, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so, I didn't hear properly your first point. I think you were saying something about the incapacitation hypothesis, but I didn't catch what it was. Could you explain it again?
So the idea was, how do you disentangle the mechanism of deterrence from the incapacitation mechanism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it actually that there's a deterrence, or is it because that the amount of, I don't know, the amount of people that go to prison actually have increased, all right? That is why that anytime the politician wins an election, then you have like the amount of people going to prison increases, and that is how the crime gets reduced. And in addition to that question, the other thing also is whether you have data on hotspot policing, for instance, right? Police deployments that could help to see whether by winning an election, there's a greater increase of police presence. And is the increase in police presence because of the election or just because the politician won the election?
Yeah. So on the first point about incapacitation, I think that so because we don't see any evidence that's consistent with the deterrence hypothesis, it all seems to be pointing away from the deterrence hypothesis. And I think a lot of those mechanism tests, it's a really interesting question about incapacitation. So what I understand the mechanism you have in mind is a politician comes into, like a politician from a particular party comes into office, or a politician comes into office and essentially like pushes more to arrest criminals in that place where he, like in his own constituency. And so rather than deterrence, it's actually that we've just taken the criminals off the streets in that area.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think actually this is probably, we should probably rephrase this as a bit, I'm just trying to come up with good shorthand names for each of these possible mechanisms. I think this one, what we're imagining here includes the incapacitation mechanism. So in general, what I'm trying to say in this slide is that we don't think the actual level of crime is going down, whether it's because of deterrence or whether it's because of other sort of, or whether it's because you've actually kind of removed criminals from the streets. None of these these sort of pattern results are consistent with either of those stories, I think. But so I think it's a good idea to make this a little bit more clear, to specify that this is not just only deterrence, but also any kind of real reduction in crime that we're trying to rule out here.
Okay. Then do you have data on hotspot policing, for instance, to actually check whether
whether the deployment? Yeah, so we don't have data on hotspot policing specifically, but what we do use is this staff inputs measure, which we've extracted from the same database. I'll come to it, when we get to that in a bit more detail. But what we've done essentially is tried to calculate from the records in both of the data sets how many officers are actually posted to a given station at a given point in time at each level. And we don't see that responding to political alignment.
I see. Okay.
So I think hotspot policing would be another margin of this sort of input story, which would be really nice to measure, but I don't know if this sort of data is available in our setting, but we can definitely look into it. Okay. Okay, great. So I'll talk about the context and the data, and then I'll discuss sort of one by one the empirical strategy and results for each of these things. First, the overall effect, and then kind of separating out our stories from each other. We have a few robustness checks if we also have the appetite for it at that point in the day, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so we're studying the district of Lahore in Pakistan. It's got a population of about 11 million people. It's divided into approximately 35 districts for members of the provincial assembly. They're first past the post single member district. And so the two election cycles that are relevant here are 2013 and 2018. And between these two elections, the governing party at both the national and the provincial level switched from the PMLN party to the PTI party. So we have two dimensions of variation that we're going to be exploiting here together. We're kind of grouping them together as a change in political alignment. The first is that in a given constituency, people might change any person might change which party they vote for, obviously, but then the second is that the winning party also changes identity. So combining those together, we get this measure of alignment, which we've shown on the map here. So you can see that in some parts of the city, we have a decrease. So for example, this particular area here on the southwest has a decrease in political alignment. This area here in the center has an increase in political alignment. Same for this kind of eastern zone as well. So we've got some parts of the city that are kind of going from in favor to out of favor with the political party in office, if you like that way of thinking about it. We're going to be looking at policing, which is obviously a core state function. It's managed by a provincial department that is the Punjab Police. And that's the same level of government as these MPAs that I just talked about on the previous slide. So MPAs are the key legislators who have oversight over this agency, the Punjab Police. So the district is divided into 83 police stations, and each one of them has its own defined geographical catchment area. It's also worth just noting here, as a part of the data exercise that we went through at the early stage of the project, that the catchment areas do not line up with the constituencies. So what we do is we overlay the two kind of shape files onto each other and just assign each station to a measure of proportion aligned. So it's the average vote share for the winning party weighted by how much of that constituency overlaps with the police station catchment area. So what happens when somebody has experienced a crime and wants to report it to the police? So they are supposed to go to the police station that's corresponding to the location of the crime or the event that occurred. Then the complaint is recorded. So this is the part that's going to change midway through the period that we study. Before 2017, somebody writes it down in a hard copy register. So over the year 2017 to 18, we see a rollout of this new system, this high-tech system, the complaints management system. It's basically a central database. You can see in the picture here that here we've got, this is actually an official PR photo from the Punjab Police. So it's a very nice kind of a setting. You have the assistant here with a police station's assistant entering the person's complaint into the computer. And so then a tracking number is issued. So every complaint that's actually registered in this way is then potentially trackable, and anybody who has a login for this database can go in and see what happened with this complaint. Then the rest of the process is supposed to be the same, both before and after this change. So the report is followed up by an inspector who's supposed to investigate further, for example, visiting the scene of the crime, interviewing people, etc. And then that inspector reports to a senior officer, and the senior officer determines whether to file what's called a first information report, or FIR. So FIRs are super important in all of South Asian policing. You need an FIR if you want to get anything else done. So if you want an arrest, if you want further action, if you want to be able to do anything basically about your complaint further to kind of prosecute it, you need a first information report. And so getting a first information report is an outcome that we're kind of interested in. It's also important to note that the statistics on these FIRs by area are discussed at regular high-level meetings, and sometimes there's kind of a discussion that may happen with the chief minister, or other kind of politicians may be asking about what's happening with the FIR numbers for this area. So we're going to use administrative microdata on all of the FIRs and complaints management system complaints over a period of several years. And this table kind of compares and contrasts the two different data sets. So the FIR data precedes the actual introduction of the complaints system, which is part of what we're going to be looking at here. We have a complaints management system that's starting in 2017. Both of them have information about the police station to which the event corresponds and the detailed category of the crime or complaint. Only the complaint management system has data on the recorded time to first contact between the police and complainant. So this is what I'm calling response time. And the most important difference that I really want to emphasize, that complaints that are not processed to the FIR stage, where somebody comes in and just says that something happened to me, and then nobody ever does anything about it after that, can be mentioned in this second data source, but will definitely not be mentioned in the FIR data, which would be the kind of standard data that one might normally be using in this kind of admin data study, where we would see only kind of what gets recorded as a crime. So we're going to aggregate categories of these complaints or crimes into several kind of, we have very, very micro level categories in the data. We're going to aggregate them into kind of logical groups based on the law and the kind of the context. So these are cognizable, or you could think about these as serious crimes. That's going to include all violent crimes and many serious non-violent cognizable, what they call serious non-violent cognizable crimes. And in these in the case of these categories, the police can kind of proceed with arrest or taking further action. They don't need to go for a court order. These can be taken to the FIR stage, and indeed that's supposed to be what happens. There's a second category, or a third category rather, of non-violent, non-cognizable, so less serious non-violent crimes in which the court order is required for further action, but these are also qualifying for an FIR, which is this ultimate thing, the piece of paper you need to be able to kind of move forward. A very small number, but not insignificant given the overall kind of size of the data set, of complaints against the police themselves. And then a really large number of loss and insurance reports. So the important thing to note about the loss and insurance reports is that, so this is actually almost half the data set in the complaint management system. This is basically, I come into the police station and I say, you know, I've lost my wallet, or I can't find my keys or whatever, something like this. In this case, if it's truly a loss report, I need a piece of paper. In particular, one of the most common things that happens here is I say, I've lost my ID, my wallet, and in it was my ID card. I need to get it back. In order to do that, I have to file a complaint. Or I might be saying I've lost something has gone lost, and I need a police piece of paper from the police saying that I've lost it in order to get the insurance to pay out. So people might want to get this kind of an outcome from the police, like this sort of report. But the key thing to note here is that if something is filed as a loss or insurance report, it does not qualify for an FIR. So the police essentially give you a piece of paper that says that the police sort of certify that you've lost this thing, and then they don't have to take it forward in any way as a crime. It's not counted in the official key performance indicators of the police, such as the number of thefts, and it's also not, value of stolen property recovered in particular is an important performance indicator used within the police to identify whether they're performing kind of as expected. And so this is the reason I'm emphasizing so much on this point is that we do see this pattern that seems to suggest that lower level property crimes might be getting downgraded into loss reports. So the mechanism we have in mind is, I walk in and I say, look, I've been mugged. And the officer might say to me, well, look, okay, we're never going to find this guy. He drove off on a motorbike. You didn't get the license plate number. Why don't we just record it as a loss? You'll get your ID card reissued and we'll be done here. And I say, fine. So that's one possible channel through which we can imagine this sort of underreporting of events happening that we've hypothesized is occurring here. And then there's just a small number of other kind of reports that don't qualify for an FIR. Okay, and before I go on to the strategy, any questions about the context and the data?
Yeah, I have a question about how people get promoted in these hierarchical structures. So are there incentives to meet some bars, and could this play a role in these loss and insurance reports downgrading?
Yes, I think that promotions are definitely a possible mechanism for people to be concerned. So we're focusing a lot here on this very top level sort of accountability from the politicians to the police in general. We haven't as yet done much to kind of unpack what's happening within the hierarchy within the station. And we have talked about doing that, and we're kind of on the fence about whether that's something that belongs in this paper or a different one. But it's definitely something we're interested in doing. And we do observe enough information, at least to get a proxy of whether people are getting promoted or whether they're getting transferred between stations. I just don't have anything to show on that today.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'll talk first about this kind of the basic results that we have, which is that there's this decrease in the total number of crimes that are actually processed to the stage of getting an FIR. So here we're going to be collapsing our data down so that we have one observation for each police station in each month in each type of complaint. And we're going to regress the inverse hyperbolic sine of the number of FIRs in that category on the political alignment with a bunch of fixed effects. So we have complaint type fixed effects, police station fixed effects, month fixed effects. And then we're going to be clustering our standard errors by the police station catchment area, which is about 80, which is exactly 83 clusters. So our identifying assumption is that the areas that have a change in alignment with the incumbent government don't have a change in crime occurrence, how crimes are reported or recorded, that corresponds with the election for other reasons related to political alignment. And we're also, to get a better handle on this and whether that assumption seems justified, going to estimate an event study version of the same thing, where the right-hand side variable is now the interaction of this change in political alignment with a whole bunch of time indicators. So I'll show you those on the graph so we can see whether there's a pre-trend and what it looks like. Okay, so overall, alignment reduces the number of crimes that police are processing. So in a number of these graphs, what I'm going to show is the event study in blue, and then also the difference in difference estimate in red at the end. This is not month 11. This is basically just the basic bog standard diff and diff type of an estimate that I showed on the first estimating equation slide. So we see that this kind of strong kind of negative effect for the difference in differences. But if you look at the event study, what we see is we have a pretty flat pre-trend. It drops pretty suddenly and then kind of stays kind of low consistently for the next 9 months after the election. And so just to think a little bit about the magnitudes here, what this would imply is that a 10 percentage point increase in the support for the winning party would imply a 3% decrease in the number of FIRs that are processed in that station. Okay, so I made a sort of laid all these out at the beginning. I'll just remind you guys again of what they are. So we're going to investigate these 3 possible mechanisms: deterrence, which per Evans's point is, I'm going to broaden to say kind of any sort of input related story, like actual reduction in crime; patronage; versus underreporting under pressure. So first, I'm going to talk in more detail about trying to rule out the deterrence or inputs-based story. So the first thing I'm just going to point out here is just the same graph I showed you a second ago, just to point out the fact that the drop in the number of crimes that are processed happens right away, and it stays stable over time. It seems really difficult to reconcile that with a story where the politicians elected into office come in, start demanding changes, increase the budgets for certain stations, give a hard time to the police officers, etc. All of those things, if you think about the kind of the causal chain that has to happen that you have to go through between electing someone from your area and actually seeing a true reduction in crime, it's really hard to envision that happening within a 1 month period, especially given that within that 1 month, you know, I mean, the politicians are kind of, the newly elected politicians are known, but they haven't really had a chance to sit and kind of allocate resources as yet. So we think that in itself seems kind of hard to reconcile with this story, but we have a bunch more tests, as I foreshadowed, to try to address this more directly. So the next is we're going to look at how complaints that are filed are actually handled. So now we're going to take our complaints data from this complaints database. We're going to trim it so that we're only using the data after the period that it really got kind of adopted and taken up. And we're going to use the data at the individual complaint level. So each observation here is one complaint entered in this complaint database. And the outcome is whether or not it actually gets processed into an FIR. So we're just running a linear probability model here where we're just checking, if you've come into the police station with a given type of complaint, so the complaint type fixed effects are in this regression as well. So with a given type of complaint, you come in, does it actually get processed and officially recorded as a crime, and which is the necessary condition for any further action to happen. So these estimates look a little noisier in the event study, but you can see the line moving down, and the difference in difference estimate is kind of robustly negative. So what we're seeing is that complaints that get filed are less likely to be processed as official crimes. breaking this down into categories, what we see is that that effect is coming from the kind of nonviolent, non-cognizable, so the less serious nonviolent crimes, and then there's a very high, you can see the standard errors here are really huge because this is a pretty small proportion of the overall data. That's why it's so noisy. But a given complaint against the police, once it's entered into the system, is also massively less likely to actually get moved forward for FIR processing. So that, again, is really hard to reconcile with a story where these areas are getting better service effectively as a result of their alignment with the winning party. The third, I think, yes.
Oh, sorry if you already said this or if you're going to get to this. So what you're showing us now is kind of the effect on processing a crime conditional on it, or processing something conditional on a complaint being filed. Have you already shown us the results on just whether on complaints filed?
I have not. I have put them in the appendix, and I was playing with whether to put them into the main results. That also actually goes down. So people are less likely to file complaints. Oh, I should say, the police stations are less likely to record complaints. So that is the reason I didn't put it in the main part of the presentation is because I think it's kind of not really a sufficient test to kind of be sure about what it's pointing to, right? So you could say that we don't think, and I don't think we need for our strategy here to think that the complaint system is like completely golden and not potentially subject to political interference for the rest of these results to make sense. We think that the complaint system itself is also being influenced by the politics. And we see that appearing in a kind of a similar result to this one. They also drop. But that in itself, because I think increasingly we're thinking about the usefulness of thinking about the complaints data as telling us about this wedge between a filed complaint and whether it actually gets processed forward.
Yeah.
So I can show that if you'd like to see it or kind of discuss it more.
I'm happy to take your word for it, but I guess what I take away from this is that you can imagine a story where like the fraction of complaints that get filed as FIRs is going down, but maybe that's because like just there's so many more complaints that like the police just can't deal with it, and that's definitely not happening here.
Right,
the complaints
exactly.
are going down, and fewer of them are getting processed.
Yes,
yes. In the direction of like, well, I don't know. It's at least more consistent with the story of police taking it more easy.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. This conversation is also helpful for me in thinking about: do we actually want to put that result up front, or is it making it more confusing? It seems like it is useful to point it out. Okay, and so there's also this suggestive pattern, which looks like it's consistent with non-crime loss reports kind of increasing in response to property crimes decreasing. So we see that the property crimes are going to be a part of this category of non-violent, non-cognizable here. Can you guys see my cursor when I'm pointing it out? And they may be it looks here in this result as though they may be substituting from non-violent, non-cognizable into loss reports. Obviously, these confidence intervals are overlapping 0. We do a bunch of different versions of this with different standard errors. So in some of them, they end up being statistically differentiable from 0, and others they don't. But the pattern here, this is why we're kind of calling it a suggestive pattern, but the pattern here does look compatible with this kind of a downgrading story where the police officer, instead of filing something as, oh, I was mugged, they might file it as, I just lost my wallet somewhere. And I think, if you give this anecdote to people in Lahore that might be the kind of response, I think people would not find it like a very odd story of what might happen if you walked into a police station with this kind of concern. And then finally, we do have, not perfect, but a couple of more direct measures of inputs themselves. So we look at whether response times change. And as you can see, it's an absolutely flat, this sort of just bouncing around a little bit here, but the diff and diff estimate is pretty much bang on 0. It really doesn't look like there's anything happening to response times. And similarly, we look at a kind of an indirect measure of staff input. So we don't have access to HR records, but we do observe in the database when particular officers' IDs kind of appear and what their levels are. And so we see that we kind of testing to see whether there's more staff being posted and whether there are more senior staff being posted, and we don't see any evidence of that either. So just to sum up, at the risk of being a little repetitive, we really don't think that what's going on here is less crime because it drops right away. The complaints that actually get filed are less likely to be processed as official crimes. Complaints against police really seem to be pretty dramatically affected in a bad way. And there seems to be this, what looks like might be a substitution between property crimes and loss reports, and then we don't see any change in the actual inputs themselves. So hopefully I've convinced you as much as we can with the data that we have that there's not actually a reduction in crime happening in these areas. So now we have to try to understand why then do we see this occurring? What's going on with the data? And so I talked about these two other stories, patronage and underreporting under pressure. So how can we tell the difference between them? So to try to understand this, we're going to look at how political alignment is interacting with the introduction of this complaints database. And we think that the complaints database, by its nature of kind of creating this online, checkable, trackable system, could make underreporting a little bit more difficult. As I sort of argued earlier, if we think that that would suggest that if there's patronage, the database should have less of an impact in aligned areas. If there's underreporting under pressure, we think the database might have more of an impact in aligned areas. And so what we're going to do to try to test this is use the fact that the rollout of this system occurred over the same period pre and post the election. So here we've tried to visualize kind of what's happening with this rollout. This was not a long, slow rollout, but what we're going to do is essentially categorize a station as, we're going to do this in a couple of different ways, but our preferred way is to categorize a station as having kind of complete take-up once 95% or more of the FIRs in the main FIR records database also appear in this database. So if we see that, let's say 100 murders took place and are recorded in the FIRs in a given station in a given month, that would be a lot, and hopefully that doesn't happen. But if we see 100 of those in the main processed crimes data, and we only see 5 in the complaints data, that looks like they haven't started really using it yet, right? So once we start to see them kind of, we're expecting to see a lot of stuff in the complaints database that doesn't appear in FIRs, but not the other way around. So once we see that they're mostly there, then we're going to consider the implementation complete. And what you can see here is that there does seem to be some level of this kind of scale up happening over the same period that we're studying. So we're going to interact these two things together. And what we see is that the political alignment effect, when the complaints database is not in use, is sort of still appearing kind of robustly. When it is in kind of what looks like pretty much complete use, the political alignment effect drops. This is significant at the 10% level, and the point estimate obviously is a lot closer to 0. So this is consistent with underreporting under pressure. Now, we might be concerned that the rollout of the complaints database itself may be affected by political alignment. Not to make this any more complicated than it already needs to be, but we do worry about this. And so what we're going to do to try to do a robustness check against this is to, instead of using this thing that I just showed in the maps, what we're going to do is just a simpler test, which is just pre-post district-wide take-up. So we do see a jump, a period at which like we go from pretty low take-up across the entire district to much higher take-up. And so we're just going to cut the data at that point in time and say, does the alignment effect look similar before and after this thing happens? That's what I'm showing here in model 2 in the gray bars. And what you can see is that we obviously lose a ton of precision here, which is to be expected since we've just kind of taken our take-up measure and made it really blocky. But the pattern of results looks very, very similar across the two estimates, which we think is encouraging for this interpretation.
Can I, Kate, just as we think about this result, can you help me understand what are the incentives for underreporting? Like, are these crime stats something that like the press has access to? Like, is this something the public fixates on? I'm just trying to imagine why a politician would like want to put pressure for police to underreport crimes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we talked a lot about this, and we talked to our the person in the police who's kind of kindly supporting us in doing this research, to understand who actually has access to the data and how might they use it. So the press do not have access to the system. In theory, the first information reports themselves are public information and subject to a public information request, but I don't think that those tend to be successful very fast, as far as I understand. The complaints, but what we know for sure is that there's a monthly meeting where all of the big dogs in the police kind of sit together at a table and look at these stats for FIRs and say, why is it going up in this area? Why is it, and like, oh, good, it's going down in this area. And that those people are in close conversation on a regular basis with the top level political leadership, the chief minister. My understanding is that there have been occasions when the chief minister himself is actually sitting in those meetings, kind of or asking questions. So the previous chief minister in Punjab had a real reputation for doing this in general across all service delivery. He would sit in meetings with bureaucrats and like really sort of interrogate them about their stats. And I'm not just talking about police, but all things. And lots of people were kind of afraid to get called in, and they knew that he was gonna kind of interrogate them, that why is this number, like, why haven't you rolled out this program? Why is this number so low? Why is this number so high? My impression, very anecdotally, is the current chief minister does not have the same sort of reputation, but the general mechanism could be there, that the senior level police know that they're gonna get a hard time from the politicians. The senior level police monitor these stats from the junior level police and ultimately hold them to account. And over the time period that we're studying, the complaints management system itself wasn't actually, like, the numbers from that were not actually the ones that were being discussed in these meetings. It was ultimately what they kind of worry about is the FIRs, which is why we think that you could see such a thing, that there would be a wedge between the two, where somebody comes in and reports a crime and it doesn't make it through to the FIRs, and that might be related to this kind of alignment effect.
Super interesting. So the politicians care about actual crime because they think that people who are suffering from crimes aren't going to vote for them. But then, like, there's the principal agent problem, where the top police dogs, they want to look good in front of the politician, and maybe if they harbor some political ambitions of their own, they want to keep doors open. Okay, this is super interesting.
Yes, I think that's a really good way of explaining it. So when we think about the underreporting sort of story, what we're imagining is exactly what you said. The politicians, so the difference between story 2 and story 3 here, like patronage versus underreporting under pressure, is that they're both involving kind of worse level of police service to the citizens, right? The difference between them is in terms of the mechanism. In story 2, the politicians are kind of willing participants in this bargain. In story 3, the underreporting under pressure, they are trying to get the police to deliver, but they're not succeeding because of the way the stats are essentially being manipulated.
That's a really nice way to put it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So yes, telling you what I've told you again, that we think that we've done this test to try to look at how the complaints database interacts with the political alignment. We see what the result is, that the effect of political alignment on the number of crimes being processed seems to disappear once the new database has been introduced. And this is suggestive that the tracking technology may help to mitigate this problem of underreporting due to political pressure. So we do some not super exciting robustness checks. There's this paper that says, we should be a little careful about differences with these, with like high frequency data. So we've also run all of these estimates where we just aggregate everything into a pre and a post period, and the results look very similar. We might also be concerned that the location of the political support in space and how it overlaps with the police station catchment areas is not random, it is spatial. If there's some spatial process underlying it, so we do spatially clustered standard errors, the results look similar. And someone flagged this at the beginning that could it be that the effect really that we're picking up on is the other way around, that it's crime affecting electoral behavior? And we think the answer to that is no. I think I have enough time to just show this. So here what we do is, instead of using the contemporaneous measure of alignment, what we do is we split the support of the 2013 winning party, that's the PMLN, into deciles, and then interact that with post-election. So this is the party that's losing in 2018. So it's basically what I'm showing you here is having been in an area, the effect of having been in an area that was on the losing side. And what we see is that this is number of complaints, but the result is going to look, I think I have the same one. Oh, no, I put the wrong graph here, but the graph is basically identical for the number of FIRs. It looks very similar, where the areas that had a higher level of support for this party that ends up losing after the election happened, they see kind of lower levels of crime being reported and recorded. So we don't think that there's a reverse causality story happening here. Okay, so we have studied the impact of political influences on policing using this administrative microdata that spans this whole election cycle. We really like the data for the reasons that I've described, that we think that having both the complaints and the FIRs gives us this wedge where we can kind of look at, help to shed light on whether there's actually a deterrence or increased input type of a story versus other sorts of stories that relate to how the data get recorded. We have, I hope, convinced you that that it's not an input or deterrence type of a story, but rather a story about how data get manipulated under pressure from politicians who are ultimately attempting to increase the quality of service to their constituents, but not succeeding in doing that because of this principal agent problem that Wayne was referring to. So one of the things that's kind of an interesting, we didn't design this study as kind of an impact evaluation of the tracking database itself, and it wasn't randomized. It would have been cool to randomize something like that. We don't think that the rollout of it is necessarily entirely exogenous, but it does seem to have some suggestion here as a potential policy implication that this type of tracking technology that might make it harder to manipulate official statistics could help to mitigate these sorts of agency problems between politicians and the bureaucrats or public servants who are sort of delivering the frontline services to constituents. So that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for great comments and questions, and love to hear any more if you have them or any other feedback. And as I said, thanks a lot. Obrigada.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. Just really fascinating stuff. I think as long as Kate's okay with it, we've still got some time to open it up for Q&A if people have follow-up questions. So we'll just open it up to the floor.
I have a small... Go ahead, Pedro.
Victor, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, okay. So thank you very much, Kate, for your presentation. So I had, I guess, a couple of questions. So one is in line a little bit with Wayne's, I think, earlier point. So if the main story here is about pressure, it would be interesting to know a bit more about how important is this for politicians. So whether there is something going from these statistics to the media, whether you could pick up these changes in the media, for instance. So have you thought about trying to collect information from newspapers retrospectively, so that we could have a sense of whether, if indeed the story is about pressure from politicians, I mean, where that pressure is coming from. So what are the motives for that? So that would be my first comment. Second comment would be, so if I understand well your story, so the electronic filing of events is working well. So the problem is the data from before. So it's the data in the books, if I understand well. So it would be interesting if you, since you have access to the data in the books, whether you could actually check whether, I mean, I don't know how what's the extent to which you could check this, but it would be interesting to have, you know, access to the books, and you know, sometimes with access to the books you can get a sense of how things are being misreported, because, you know, there is differences over time. You know, there are many things that can happen to these books, so that you could have a direct way to show that indeed there is a problem of reporting for the books, and not as you are giving a suggestive, of course, evidence that the electronic way of filing the events is working better. But if you could have direct ways of checking for the books, that would be, I think, an addition. So those would be my two comments. Thank you.
Could you just talk more about that? So you're talking about looking more at the patterns of what gets reported more or less, or I don't think I understood the second point properly.
So if you could have access to the books, for instance, I always remember about this case in which you know, books are being cooked in different ways. Sometimes it's the numbers, sometimes it's changes over time, because you look at the same books over time, things could change. So there is little things that you could do if you have access to the books. I don't know whether you have access to the books, but
oh, you're talking about the physical, like the register that they used in the pre-period, exactly. Where okay, yeah. Okay. I think that would be interesting to know. I have no idea whether we could get access to them. I'm not very sure. I'd have to talk to my colleagues about it. My expectation would be that there's going to be a lot of stuff missing from them, but I could be wrong. I guess I think about the technology here as not necessarily, so it might be the case that the exact same information appears in those hard copy books as appears in the complaints database, but it's just easier to pull it out, because to get the information about a specific complaint that happened in the pre-period, you'd have to go to the station, you know, find the relevant book, look up the relevant date. There's no tracking number. There's no way really to access it. So it represents kind of a pretty dramatic reduction in cost in accessing the information. So I guess I'm trying to understand that what sort of thing would we be expecting to see? So even if we did see that there was no kind of difference in the patterns of what appeared in the books and the database, that wouldn't necessarily come at odds with the story that we're imagining here. Or are you thinking that there's some version of what we see kind of appearing in the hard copies that would imply a different mechanism?
My comment is just on the technology of cooking the data, which is to a certain extent a big part of what you're talking about here. So it's just that whether, I mean, you can find evidence in the non-electronic data by looking at this data, at these data sources, whether you could find evidence that people are cooking the books. Actually, I mean, they are actually doing that. So that would be, I mean, it's basically complementary to your story.
Right. Yeah, I will talk to my colleagues about whether that is something that we could access or not, and whether how long they keep them and that sort of thing. That's a really interesting idea. The first point that you made was about why the politicians care about the stats like I think you mentioned, and someone else had talked about this earlier, that do the media have access to these statistics, or and I hadn't thought about the media from that point of view, that as a motivator for the politicians. It could be if these data were available to the media. I think about more of a direct channel where the politicians just kind of expect that if the security situation or if the crime situation deteriorates, that might directly affect their voting, their vote numbers, and so they don't necessarily need the media as an intermediary to care about what the numbers look like for their constituents, but that might not be the case. So it would be nice to get at least at the minimum, kind of qualitative evidence about that. Like what I think we do kind of know anecdotally that the politicians grill the public servants, but it would be nice to know more about, why and in what situations. Yeah.
Yes, so actually it's kind of following up on Pedro's point. I'm wondering if really this idea is about putting pressure for electoral benefit, should it increase with the vote share, or should it be magnified in places that are close election, switching points?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I think there's a super old kind of classical literature in political science about hasn't really talked about policing, but talks a lot about when politicians allocate resources do they allocate them to core or swing places? Like, do you basically want to spend money on the people that are kind of your base, or do you want to spend money on the people that might be marginal to vote for you? And I think that there's just still my understanding is still kind of an active literature kind of testing this empirically in different contexts and trying to understand why and in what situations they do each of those. I think the appendix slide that I showed here, I think we have a version, I didn't put it in the slide deck. I think we have a version of our estimates that looks like this, but for our, like, not the robustness check, the main result. This kind of pattern, which looks pretty monotonically increasing in the deciles of support, suggests that they're going for their core. Like if it's a story, if you accept kind of the story that we've made, that they are attempting to help their own constituencies, and not for because if there were a swing voters kind of a mechanism happening, you should expect to see this like looking like a U or an upside down U or something, where it's the ones who are kind of closest to marginal would be the ones that where the most was happening or the least was happening, depending on the way around you look at it. That doesn't look like the pattern we're seeing here. So I guess what they're doing is really targeting their core. But I think the interpretation, I don't know that we have a super strong interpretation about this because of the fact that we don't have data directly on constituencies. We're overlaying the constituencies against the police station boundaries. And that's a limitation of the data, that we don't know the exact location of the crime. We know the police station catchment area it happened in. So I wouldn't want to make too strong of a statement about this, but just the pattern here looks to me more like a core, targeting core argument.
Kate, may I ask a question? Like, following up on the same question I had before about the promotion policies. So from the story you presented, it seems that the politicians are the bad guys and the public servants kind of the victims. So they are operating under pressure, so they're kind of forced to fabricate some stats to make the politician look good. Could it be the other way around? So having an MPA who's aligned kind of generates an elevator effect. So if I have to bet on my promotion, this is a good time. So this is the time to go all in and present the best stats I can present, because this is the time I can get the most for the buck. Is that a possible story?
So can you say can you say the mechanism you have in mind, like the last part again? You said that the MPAs might be worrying about the election and therefore?
No, it's at the police level, so the public servant side. So instead of being the principal putting pressure on the agent, is the agent taking advantage of the principal, because now the principal has better political alignment. So I don't know how the promotion policy works. So if I want to jump from my position to 1 or 2 levels above, this is a good timing. So if I present the best statistics now, I know that the person above me is in a better position to help me proceed in my career.
Right. Yes, I think that, so first of all, I did not intend to put like a normative judgment on any of the players in this game. So I may have done that kind of informally, and I shouldn't have. I think that the story that you're describing is I would also think about that as being a part of the story that we're imagining here, of the underreporting under political pressure. So it could be that, yeah, so you're saying they underreport, not because they're necessarily concerned that they might get fired, but because actually I think it's very difficult to fire them, but it's not because they're concerned about negative consequences, but because they are hopeful for positive consequences from the politician. So the politician in office from the winning party has more of a possibility of influencing their promotions and that sort of thing. And I think I would sort of class that all as a part of this story. And I like the idea. And I think it is something that we can, definitely the promotions is something that we've started kind of looking at, trying to see if we can extract that from the records in the data. And it's something we could potentially, we can try to test for it empirically. I don't know if we're going to have enough power to get at it or not, but we should definitely try.
Thank you.
I have another point related to the pressure and to the concerns about politicians, about voters. So would you be able, maybe with another data set, maybe with a survey, to establish a correlation between concerns voters have about crime and voting? So that would also be, a way to motivate a little bit the earlier issue on pressure. So if you are able to give numbers on this correlation, even if it is just a correlation, that could give us a reassurance that indeed there is a concern by politicians, either through the media or directly, about crime in terms of politics.
I don't necessarily have direct access. Maybe.
Kate, I don't know about anyone else, but I think you're cutting out for me a bit. We may have some connection issues. Not sure if you can hear me. Well, okay, Kate, I see your video. Let's see. Can you hear us? Are you back with us?
Sorry, yes, one. Yes, we have problems with the connection, right?
Yeah, it looks like we do. I think we may have lost Kate.
I'm not hearing you well, sorry.
It's okay, Raquel. Let me just try and chatting to
yeah,
Kate.
So we're gonna finish the webinar.
Okay.
What do you think, Pedro and Katia?
Wayne is hosting.
Sorry?
Wayne is hosting. I don't know. Yeah.
I've just sent a chat to Kate, but I'm not getting any response from her. So maybe we'll end it there. Thank everyone for coming, and look forward to future webinars. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.